Hi everyone, my name is Rihanna and I'm part of a food solutions company called Sirius SA. We serve the greater food manufacturing community with all technical and operational related requirements. Feel free to visit our website at sirius.co.za and make contact with us. We would love to meet you, have a chat and see how we can assist you in any way possible. Today, myself and Matthew will be discussing FSSC 22000 version 5.1, which came out in November of 2020. There are 15 new additional requirements that you need to take note of, and so we will be fleshing these out and discussing and giving examples of how you can implement this in your organization. We will be focusing on part 2 of the scheme, which is the requirements for organizations to be audited. Our target audience, you would be interested in this discussion if you are part of an organization in the food supply chain needing to implement the scheme's additional requirements, or if you are an auditor or consultant needing to familiarize yourself with the additional requirements of the scheme, or then any organization or individual in the food supply chain that are interested in the requirements of the scheme. The objectives of today's discussion is firstly to become familiar with the additional requirements of the scheme, and secondly to identify ways to address the additional requirements in your organization. We will be looking at quite a lot of examples and discussing this to give you a good understanding of how you can implement this in your organization. The prerequisites, firstly, it is imperative that you need to have knowledge and experience of FSSC 22000. You need to have a working knowledge of quality management systems. And then very important, you need to have a copy of the FSSC 22000 scheme version 5.1 with you. If you don't, then please pause the presentation and get a copy with you so that you can follow as we go along and discuss these requirements. Right, jumping into the presentation. Version 5.1 of the FSSC 22000 scheme was published in November of 2020. The scheme is organized in 6 parts. As I said, our focus will be on part 2, the requirements for organizations to be audited. It defines the requirements to achieve and maintain FSSC 22000 certification. Very important, there are 9 different categories of the scheme. I've listed them here for you. You need to identify in which category your organization falls. For more information on this and all the subcategories, you need to look at the table in section 3 of the scheme overview. You will find that on page 8 onwards of the scheme. So firstly, with the requirements, you will find the requirements, as I said, from page 8 onwards, you will see a table there. Firstly, you need to identify the category and the subcategory that your organization falls under. There's a description and a little example of the type of production taking place. If you've identified in which category and subcategory you fall into, or your organization falls into, then on the right-hand side, you will find the PRP specified for that exact subcategory. So for instance, in this case, I've just taken a snippet out of category 1. Let's say you fall under subcategory A1, then those are the 3 PRPs that need to be implemented. You'll see the third one, it says FSSC 22000 additional requirements, and that is the one that we will be talking about today. Right, jumping into it. As I said, we've got 15 new additional requirements. Matthew will be taking us through these and fleshing it out for us and navigating us through these different requirements, giving us examples of how we can implement these in our organizations.
So additional requirements. The FSSC previous version had 7 additional requirements, and this new version 5.1 has 15 additional requirements. So there's a considerable increase in the number of additional requirements that we have to go through. So we're going to now go through each one of these. The first additional requirement is the management of services and purchased material. So they've got specific here about purchased material. Firstly, specifically about the laboratories you use. Any laboratories that we use for validating or verifying food safety have to be competent. And competent means that they have to be capable to produce precise and repeatable test results using validated test methods. What this essentially means, and we'll get into more detail about the specifics of it, is that your lab has to be accredited, or your lab has to be a part of a proficiency scheme. You can't just do microbiology on an on-site lab without that lab demonstrating that those results are repeatable, are true. So you can't merely just have a corner in your facility where you do testing. Your laboratory results have to be compared to a SANIS accredited laboratory or any other accredited laboratory that uses accredited methods for that test. And the one side is validation, but when we look at the verification of food safety, that's looking at final product testing, your hand swabs, your equipment swabs, essentially any micro test that you do, because you're only doing it to validate or verify. Needs to be done by a competent lab. So if you have an on-site lab, the ideal thing would be that lab being accredited. However, you can have an unaccredited lab on site, but then you need to make sure that your lab is doing either inter-lab testing with other accredited labs or on a proficiency scheme so that the results are proven or show to be valid. They show to be repeatable. They show to be the same as someone that is accredited. So for categories C, D, I, G, and K, there needs to be a documented procedure to procure in the event of an emergency to ensure the final product conforms to specification. And so what that means is that you have to control your suppliers so that when you run out of something, you have approved suppliers ready to receive, ready to supply you. You can't just randomly approve or randomly procure something from someone without them being approved on your approved supplier list.
So that means I can't just go to somewhere else and quickly get something.
So say for instance, I think a great example to look at this would be having tomato sauce. You use this particular tomato sauce in your product, and you've been buying for the last 15 years from the same client and everything's been perfect. And then all of a sudden their factory burns down, they can't supply you, they run out of stock. You need to have a plan in place. Now, you need to make sure that the supplier you're going to buy your new tomato sauce from to make your product is approved.
So basically for each and every raw material that you're going to use, you need at least 2 suppliers on that approved supplier list.
Definitely. So the suggestion would be probably 3, but certainly 2, that you've always got a backup supplier in place for all your raw materials. When procuring animal, fish, and seafood, there's a need for a policy to control prohibited substances. I know for a fact in the beef industry, animals, cows often can get sick. Bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis is quite common. And when they are sick, they inject them with veterinary residues or veterinary medicines, which create residues. And so you have to make sure that you've got a program in place to make sure that sick cows are not slaughtered and not entering the supply chain. The same goes with fish. There's been serious studies around the South African coastline and globally as well, that different levels of fish are actually picking up pesticide residues and heavy metals from the different water sources. And it's present there. So you must make sure that you've got a program in place to mitigate the potential risks. Luckily, South Africa and Europe and America, they all have very strong standards when it comes to heavy metals and pesticide residue levels and veterinary medicines. You just have to make sure that you've got a document in place
Yes.
to specifically manage those hazards.
Yeah, and identify them obviously for each of your products.
Yeah. Where there's no legislation, if you were sitting in Africa and there might be a certain country that doesn't have pesticide residue levels, the FSSC requires that if you want to meet the requirements of these additional requirements, you need to make sure you have something in place for any hazards, and that will involve you needing to research what hazards are associated with the products you are making, and go in excess of just what your country needs, but what sort of best practice.
Yeah.
Probably one of the best places to look at that would be Codex Alimentarius.
Yes.
And then lastly, there needs to be a review process for product specifications to ensure compliance with food safety, legal and customer requirements.
So that basically means that if I have a specification in place, it works, it's been like that for years, I can't just leave it there and let it sit. I have to actually go back to it and review it.
Exactly. So from a product specification perspective, let's think of our tomato sauce spec again as an example. You have a spec in place, you procure that spec, and you've used it for the last 10 years, and it's fine. But you need to make sure that at a predefined interval, probably annually, but it depends on the nature of the product and the risk of the product, that you revise it and make sure that it's still current. The whole point of this is really making sure that the ingredients that are coming in, especially when it's a compound ingredient like tomato sauce, that nothing's changed. And not necessarily just with the ingredient, but maybe the laws have changed. Maybe the heavy metal limits have changed, and now all of a sudden your spec that used to be at a certain level is now illegal. And so you need to make sure that it becomes current.
Okay.
So it does form part of the HACCP review process if you're doing that properly. However, the FSSC additional requirement says you need to make emphasis on making sure that you review your specs at a predefined interval. So is it every year or every 3 years? It doesn't matter. You need to determine that based on your risk, but you need to justify your risk.
Yeah. All right, so our next requirement that we're going to look at is product labeling.
So this is quite a simple one and an easy one to achieve. The finished product that you manufacture has to be labeled according to the regulatory requirements in the country of intended sale. So you need to identify the international regulations as well as your local regulations and make sure that wherever you sell the product that it complies to those regulations. The challenge comes that you might be in an English country as we are, where our main labeling is in English, and now you're sending it out to China or Japan, which has a completely different language. The interpretation of their legislation is going to be tricky. So you need to make sure that if you are exporting to a place like somewhere in the East where we don't understand the language, or Russia or Eastern Europe, that we have translators in place and that we make sure we still identify it.
Complies.
It raises an interesting issue where you might be using an agent to export. You're manufacturing for the agent. You're not manufacturing for the export market, but indirectly you are manufacturing for the export market. And this is where a gray area comes into play. Theoretically, you must make sure that where you are intending to sell it, although it's going to an agent, you're still intending to sell it to Russia or Japan, that you take responsibility for that labeling. However, this might come in the form of contracts being managed between you and the export agent. If any unlabeled products are manufactured, you have to make sure that all the product information is available for customers and consumers on safe use of the product. So that normally forms part of the specification, product specification. I know in South African regulations R146, they do talk about the size of products that need to have specific labels and information on the labels. I think a good South African example is a chappy.
Those small little bubble gums.
There's no way you can put enough product information on an individual chappy. However, the unit that you sell the chappy in, you don't sell chappies as one chappy. You do in a shop. So the shop needs the information available to give to a customer.
Okay.
However, the unit that has a number of chappies in it, a
Mhm.
packet, is going to have the product information as required by the law.
Yes.
And the FSSC is going to be pedantic about this to make sure that all product information is available for that type of product.
Sure.
Additional requirement number 3, food defense.
Yeah, just Matthew, maybe just shortly explain to us, maybe in 1 or 2 sentences, just what do you mean by food defense?
Food defense is intentional harm to either the product or your brand, with a specific emphasis on the food safety of your product. So
Okay.
I think one of the good examples is in Australia, they had strawberries, and customers complained that there were needles in their strawberries or pins in their strawberries. Obviously, the retailer immediately blamed the manufacturer.
Yeah.
Maybe there was a disgruntled staff member,
Mm.
which needs to be managed. And it turned out, after the investigation was concluded, that it was a disgruntled worker in the retailer's distribution center. And they found that out because it was 2 separate suppliers of the strawberries that went to the same distribution center that both had needles in them.
Okay.
And so the program, obviously, internally from your perspective as a manufacturer, needs to be how you mitigate risks within your organization, but also that you prevent risks in somewhere else further down the
Yeah.
food supply chain.
Yeah.
And that's where things like tamper evident packaging come into play.
Okay.
That's where things like managing your staff to identify if they might have become disgruntled.
Yeah.
And so there's a mechanism that we have to follow to try and identify what the threats are. In food defense, we talk about TACCIP, we talk about a threat assessment. So one has to conduct a threat assessment, and there needs to be a document procedure in place to enable the organization to conduct a threat assessment. So the first thing is you need a procedure defining how are we going to identify the threats.
Mm.
And at the end of the sentence, we then have to make sure we mitigate the significant threats. And it's very interesting that they put it this way. The first thing is we need to conduct a threat assessment. We have to identify what is the threat to our business. Yeah. Is it someone sabotaging our product? So in the case of the strawberries, their threat assessment should have said, after we've sent the strawberries out, our packaging can be opened and someone can contaminate it. Once they know that their product can be opened, and they said the threat is that it can be opened and sabotaged, to mitigate it, they would have put some sort of tamper evidence seal on there to demonstrate that it hasn't been tampered with.
Yes.
So your mitigation step is defining a control measure. It's nice to use control measures because we know what it's about, to make sure that that threat's addressed. And the nice thing here is that they use the word significant.
Mm.
Significant is something that we've used in HACCP and in ISO 22000 for a very, very long time. And that's all about risk. And risk has 2 components. The 2 components are likelihood. What's the likelihood it's going to happen? What's the possibility of it happening?
Mm.
And severity. Severity, what will happen if it happens? If someone sabotages our strawberries, what's going to happen? And obviously, in the case of needles, there was massive brand reputation, costing millions and millions. I mean, it cost a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah.
There was the recall costs, brand reputation costs, and then if you ingest something like a needle, or in the case of maybe someone sabotages and put glass in your product, and you must take that risk into account. So it's both the likelihood and the risk. So once you've conducted a threat assessment, you've assigned risk to that threat, and you've put measures in place to mitigate the risk, you then need to develop a food defense plan. And what a food defense plan is where you write down, these are the measures I put in place for the identified threats. The plan that you create must encompass all processes and products within the scope of the organization. So you need to consider every single process and product that you make, and make sure that your control measures are effective or are defined for each and every threat. And you need to make sure that those are collated together in a document called your food defense plan, and that's essentially your procedures that you need to follow to make sure the threats are mitigated.
Okay.
They talk about processes and products.
Mm.
What is a process? What is a product? I suppose they're looking at everything. You need to go
Yeah.
from the entry, from people coming on site, what people can do when they're on site.
Yeah.
Maybe untrained people operating with your recipes or
Yes.
operating with your machinery if they don't know what they're doing, if they're
Yeah.
not sticking to the recipe.
Yeah.
You could overdose on preservatives. You could not cook properly.
Yeah.
So this element of training of staff and preparing them to be ready to do work falls within the food defense plan.
So it really includes everything.
It includes everything from farm to fork. I suppose it's even making sure your person at receiving is trained to make sure that you're receiving stuff according to spec.
Yeah.
The nice thing is you can refer to other system elements. You're going to have PRPs in place. Your receiving PRP will specify the person needing to be receiving.
Yes.
So you in your food defense plan could refer to the receiving process,
so those
making
things,
sure they know about it.
Yeah, will already be there. Okay.
You just have to document it thoroughly.
Yes.
Then the food defense plan must be supported by the organization's food safety management system. What that basically means is the entire system that you put in place is there to make sure that your food defense plan is successful. So you mustn't have contradictory things. If your food defense plan requires you to lock all the doors and only let authorized people in, your organization's system must make sure that that's practical and possible. And then lastly, the plan must comply with applicable legislation and be kept up to date. This is a foresight thing, and certainly in South Africa, our legislation doesn't really call into effect specific food defense stuff. However, it's all about making sure that the last comment I want to make on this, and we'll do it in food fraud as well, is there should be some mechanism to verify that you actually are implementing these controls. So your food defense plan might say this is what we must do, but you actually need to verify it, double check that you actually are doing it and it is implemented.
That brings us to food fraud mitigation.
Food fraud is exactly the same in terms of the wording FSSC's additional requirements are using as food defense. The only difference with food fraud is that you're looking at vulnerabilities primarily to your raw materials, and you need to try and identify what vulnerabilities there are. The classic example is honey. Honey can get mixed with sugar, glucose syrup, and it's very difficult to detect. There's a reason people call it fraud. It's because people do it, make money out of it, and most people don't know that it's happening.
Yeah.
So there's a number. It gets quite tricky. There's a number of different steps. There's a number of different products out there and research papers out there with food fraud. This is a whole science in its own right. Essentially, we have to identify what the vulnerability is. Is it being diluted? Is it being mislabeled?
Yeah.
We need to identify what the fraud is to your raw material. And then we need to put steps in place to mitigate that. And the best way to do food fraud, we're briefly covering it here. You have to have a procedure in place to make sure that you conduct a vulnerability assessment. Identify what the vulnerabilities are to your raw materials.
Yeah.
Note that they don't talk about raw materials here.
Yeah.
So are there any other potential areas within your business that can result in fraud? Now, the definition for food fraud is untoward practices for economic gain. And they talk again about significant vulnerabilities.
Yes.
So you might do something that has no bearing on the safety of your product.
Yes.
Is that significant or not? Well, it might be a brand reputation thing where customers feel they get cheated. And there's a number of markers that one has to consider. Is there a history of fraud? So with honey, we know there's a big history of fraud. With honey, if you get cheap honey, the price is an indicator that something bad is going on.
Yeah.
The ability to test that fraud. So I was actually in a garlic factory the other day, and we chatted about food fraud, and there was a big scam in the garlic industry about having radishes and cauliflower and dried vegetable powder being added to garlic. And it's a real thing, and the reason they do that is because you can't see it, especially on dried garlic, and you're buying containers of this stuff. And some of it's a very price competitive commodity item.
Yes.
You don't know what you're getting or not.
Yeah. Milk would be another example.
Milk would be a
adding
very
water to
big
milk.
one.
That's a very easy thing to do, and if
Yeah.
you don't have the equipment to test it, then
and you'll see here at the last point that the policy or the plan must comply with applicable legislation. If we talk about milk and the dilution with water, one of the requirements is to do a freezing point test. That's there to determine the potential for water addition into milk.
Yes.
So we do have laws in place that need to be implemented to make sure we mitigate it in the case of milk. In the case of garlic, we have nothing. There's no law that says, you know, the way garlic must be received.
Yeah.
But these things happen, and so you need to make sure that you identify what the threat is. There might be garlic diluted with radishes. And you must go through this mechanism of identifying, well, is it easy to detect? How do we detect it? How are we going to mitigate it? And probably the biggest way of getting around it is knowing what the current commodity price is.
Yes.
And not buying stuff that's super cheap, because if it's so cheap, you're probably going to have some sort of fraud happening.
Yeah. And then again, Sirius SA will be able to help with that.
Definitely. So we've developed a very integrated food fraud mitigation tool. It's an extensive tool, but it almost simplifies the process as well.
Okay.
And it allows us to consider everything, all the types of fraud. And then we go through a whole mechanism based on extensive research, where we look at various parameters like history of fraud, like supplier management. Maybe you've got a supplier that's a bit dodgy. Looking at the types of fraud and the way that testing comes into it, and we put it in a scored mechanism to give us an indication of whether that ingredient from a specific supplier is potentially fraudulent. It puts it on a risk matrix, and you've got high risk and low risk, and the high risk things you need to address.
Yes.
And it forces you to put control measures in place, and that's what you need to have some mitigation measures in place for that. And just to clarify, so internally, certainly in bigger organizations, KPIs, key performance indexes, are put in place. If your production key performance index is all about the volume that you make and the speed that you make it, you're going to be compromising on the quality of the product.
Yes.
The minute you're compromising on quality, there's an element of compromising in safety.
Yeah.
So again, in the garlic industry, they hydrate dehydrated garlic.
Yeah.
You know, when you hydrate something, it still has its shape and its form and its substance. If you go and get a tub of garlic and you just see water in there and you think it's oil, it's actually because they've added more water.
Yeah.
When you drain that water and then you weigh the amount of garlic, and then you actually have your hydrated garlic, then you see how much is actually in the tub. So if it says 300 grams of garlic, is it 300 grams of garlic that's hydrated, or is it like 150 grams of hydrated garlic with another 150 grams of water inside? Another classic example is in the chemical industry. You get different formulations. Chemicals are mixed with water. When you buy a 25-liter drum of hand soap, there's water in there. And depending on the quality of the soap and the amount of functional ingredient, it performs differently. I'm sure people have looked at dishwashing soap. You go buy your Sunlight liquid, or you go buy your cheaper whatever liquid, your green soap that foams. They work differently.
Yeah.
And they cost differently, and some of them are thinner than others. The cost, the cheap one is not as effective as the more expensive one.
Yeah.
Don't be fooled though. Brand names also exist. So you can have good quality stuff that's cheaper. But when brand and marketing comes into it, obviously that affects the price as well. But feel free to contact Sirius, and we can certainly help out with the food fraud tool. And we'll also have training specifically on food fraud, because food fraud is a very intricate and detailed process. So is food defense.
Yes.
And we also do host training to do that. In terms of logo use, this is very similar to what was previously in the standard. It's all about using the FSSC logo once you've got
that green
your
logo
certification in place. The green, the specific green logo.
Yes.
So if your organization is certified, you may only use the logo for marketing activities, such as in your printed material, on your letterhead, on your
Yes.
signature, on your email signatures.
Yeah.
There are very, very, very strict requirements regarding using the logo. And if you were to look at page 19 of the scheme document, it's printed out there
Yeah, there's a
in
table.
black and white, and there's
Yeah.
a table that needs to be
Yeah.
followed in terms of the colors that you use and the size and all that.
Yeah.
If the logo is used, it must be used in color. So if you've got a color label or color thing, you have to use the logo in the color as per the specifications in the table. You can only use a black and white logo if all other text and images are black and white. So if everything is in black and white, then you can use a black and white. Otherwise, you must use the color logo.
Okay.
And then in terms of the logo, and this is the most important part, the logo and any statement or reference to certification status may not be used on a product, the product labeling, and the packaging of the product, whether it's primary, secondary, or other, or in any other manner that implies that the FSSC 22000 approves a product, process, or service. Your business and your management system is FSSC 22000 certified. Nothing else. It's not saying that this batch of product is going to be safe.
Oh, okay.
It's not there to show that one batch is perfect.
Yes.
It's to say that you've got a good system in place and that
Yes.
you're managing your system and that your system is suitably designed that it should mitigate risks.
Okay. So it's the organization that is certified, not the product that is certified.
Exactly. The organization is certified and the food safety management system is certified.
Okay.
Not your individual product. Number 6, management of allergens.
Yes.
In South Africa, R146 of 2010 has dealt with our allergens, with the 8-man allergens. There's a regulatory requirement for allergens.
Yeah.
In some other countries, there may not be regulations in place. Obviously, Europe, Canada, America, Australia, they've all got very good allergen regulations in place. But even if there's no specific allergen legislation in the country you may be working in, the FSSC requires you to have a documented allergen management plan. Your plan has to have a risk assessment covering all sources of allergen cross-contamination. Obviously, allergens can come in through your raw materials, but allergens can also come on your peanut butter sandwiches in your canteen at lunchtime.
So even if I don't work with allergens in the factory itself, there can be cross-contamination in other ways.
Definitely. And all of these cross-contaminations need to be assessed and mitigated. And then once we've done some sort of risk assessment and assessed where all potential sources of allergens may come in and cross-contaminate, we need to put a plan in place with control measures to reduce or eliminate risks. So storage practices, spillage practices. If there was a spillage in your raw material store, how we handle that, where you store your allergens. Again, we've got a training in place for allergen management, which just gives you sort of more details on how to manage allergens. But essentially, you need to identify what allergens are. Allergens may be identified legally or by customer requirements. I know in South Africa, we've got 8 main allergens, but some of our retailers have defined other things as allergens. Things like sesame seeds and mustard seeds.
And then you have to handle that as an allergen.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so you need to make sure that you've got those control measures in place for any risk of allergen. The polony was cooked. It's a cooked product. So that must have been contaminated after cooking.
Yes.
Which means something in the environment contaminated
it.
the polony after cooking. An environmental monitoring program testing for listeria, knowing listeria is a risk for processed meat products, would have certainly highlighted in that facility that there is an issue.
Yes.
And if you pick up that issue, you can act on that issue before it becomes a food safety outbreak.
Yeah.
The requirements, the additional requirements state that there should be an implemented environmental monitoring plan with a risk-based approach. So what that means is, what are the risks in our factory? It links in line with the ISO 22000 standard saying, what are your internal and external factors?
Yeah.
When I manufacture polony, I know that Listeria is a risk. It's a bug. We can test for it.
Yes.
I understand that the risk is after cooking. So we understand it's a risk. We know it's a risk. So our environmental monitoring plan must make sure that we are at least looking for that risk and mitigating that risk. We have to contain a documented procedure for evaluation of the effectiveness of all controls on preventing contamination from the manufacturing environment. A classic example with Listeria is environmental. Listeria ends up in the drains. Listeria ends up all over the place. You need a documented procedure to evaluate the effectiveness of the controls. What's your control for Listeria? It's cleaning.
Yes.
You're going to clean your factory. You need a documented procedure to evaluate how effective your cleaning is.
Yes. So you have to verify that your control is actually doing what it's supposed to do.
If I am specifically cleaning to remove the Listeria risk, I need to test for Listeria to verify cleaning works.
Yes.
That's what that clause means.
Okay.
It can be expanded as well, because you have to look at all risks.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily just the microbiological risk.
Yeah.
If you're exporting to Europe, Europe does not allow QAC sanitizers, QAC at all. And a lot of the South African disinfectants have QACs. It's allowed in South Africa. If a QAC is picked up in Europe, your batches are rejected. You must make sure you're not using QACs. Do you test for QACs? Can you do some sort of samples to make sure it's not there? Be very aware of where you're exporting to, what the limits are going to be. Same goes for pesticide residues, same goes for veterinary residues, and understanding what's required on the export front and making sure we mitigate that.
Yeah.
The minimum requirement is the evaluation of microbiological and allergen controls.
Yeah.
We have controls for allergens. We need to make sure that we monitor to such an extent that the allergens are removed.
Yes.
So if we say that cleaning of a surface to remove allergen residues is in place, then we must clean and we must check that it has been removed.
That it has been effectively cleaned.
That can be very costly. So the allergen program will be developed, but you have to have some sort of monitoring process in place to show that the cleaning has removed those allergens. Do you have to do it every time? It doesn't say every time. It doesn't say every single time you produce an allergen, you must do a swab.
No, it doesn't say that.
It's not what the standard says, but it's a risk-based approach.
Yeah.
So if you're working peanuts, and we know that peanuts give severe anaphylactic shock,
yes,
then maybe when you're working the peanuts, you do it after doing the peanuts to be double sure that your peanut residue is removed, because you don't want to harm someone with a peanut allergy.
Depending on the risk.
If it's merely wheat protein, maybe it's not as bad as a peanut allergy.
Yes.
So maybe you wouldn't be as pedantic about it.
Yeah.
But you must follow your program and still, at some predetermined interval, put something in place to check that the wheat allergen has been removed. On the microbiological front, is it only after cleaning? Not necessarily, because one of the things you need to check is, are you cleaning frequently enough?
Yes.
If you're running the whole day on a mincer and you're mincing your meat all the time, what happens halfway through the day? Have we started contaminating?
Yes.
Is there pathogen growth halfway through the day? Maybe we have to clean at lunchtime to make sure that we reduce the load.
Okay.
So it is a good idea to do swabbing on pathogens during the middle of the day.
During your processing.
We're just talking about this in terms of understanding environmental monitoring, and that this is an essential additional requirement for the FSSC 22000 version 5.1. Again, Sirius SA has a training program and some information on environmental monitoring, so it would be a good idea for you to go down that wormhole and investigate further into environmental monitoring best practices and to expand on that. They do say evaluation of micro and allergen controls, but there are other things that one can do to do it. We are very involved with luminescent markers.
Okay.
Luminescent markers show that our cleaning works, and it's a way of keeping your people on their toes by testing them out using black lights and luminescent markers. The other thing is using hygiene indicators. We've got a hygiene indicator that works on catalase. Most pathogens and organisms you find in the food industry end up creating catalase, and this hygiene indicator can break down a biofilm and react with the catalase within the biofilm.
Yes.
It's an immediate action. it's a cost-effective way because you're probably paying about R1 per test.
Sure.
So you can, for the same price as a single TMA swab, you can probably go and test about 40 different sites within your factory.
Yeah.
So I would rather know that I've looked at 40 sites
Yes.
than only looked at one.
Yes.
It doesn't mean you mustn't do a swab for TMA.
Yeah.
You must do your swabs anyway. But by using a tube of hygiene indicator, you can really be effective at being visible on a daily basis.
Maybe also identify those spots where extra cleaning is required or the more contaminated areas.
Definitely. You need to be an inspector. You need to go and have this mindset of, I'm going to find the dirt.
Yeah.
I'm going to find out where the problems are.
Yeah.
If you're going to be fabricating this and dipping your swab into some sanitizer and sending it to the lab and just saying it was on some random table somewhere, that's not being effective. You need to have a risk-based approach and be effective. And then lastly, any of the monitoring activities you do, you must put a trend analysis together. So you must take that data and look at the trends. Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Do we continually have a problem in a certain area? We need to look at it as data. We need to analyze that data to make informed decisions.
Okay.
Right, formulation of products. Formulation of products is only for category D, and that's specifically looking at animal feed. You need to have a procedure in place to manage the use of ingredients that contain nutrients that can have an adverse animal health impact. It's quite a specific requirement.
Yes.
But it's just about making sure that we use our ingredients correctly and that animal health is considered when developing it.
Okay.
Transport and delivery. This is only for category F1, which is your warehousing and transport. All products must be transported and delivered in such a way to minimize the potential for contamination.
Oh, that's something that we are supposed to already look at.
Well, one would think so.
Yes.
The nature is that the scopes have been extended to include transportation of food.
Yes.
So FSSC is looking at the whole food supply chain. So, obviously I come out of a manufacturing environment. I've known about this for the last 100,000 years. But if you're a transport company, you wouldn't have known about this.
Yeah.
So transport companies now need to make sure that they have mechanisms in place to minimize the potential for contamination.
Yeah.
That being said, R638, which is our general hygiene requirements for the handling and transportation of food and storage of food, is very specific. You need a certificate of analysis, and on your certificate of analysis, all your trucks and your transport vehicles must be listed.
Yes.
Which means that actually, if you've got a truck or a transport company, you should have a certificate of acceptability for the handling of food in a safe way.
Yeah.
And so our regulation framework in South Africa is developed to make sure that we manage the potential for contamination, the hygiene of our trucks and whatnot. Storage and warehousing. There needs to be a stock rotation system in place. It must be defined and implemented. So it's not okay just to say we do FIFO stock rotation, but we actually must do FIFO stock rotation.
Implemented.
And we must implement it. You can choose which ones you want, and I suppose you could also do hybrids if you want. So if you say for this product it's FIFO, first expired, first out, and this stuff is first in, first out because it's long shelf life, however you define it, we must make sure that it's in place.
Yeah.
And this is applicable to all categories, wherever stuff is stored, not just for storage and warehousing facilities. If the organization slaughters animals, so this clause is specific about the slaughtering of animals, there must be specified requirements in place that define post-slaughter time and temperature in relation to the chilling and freezing of the product. Again, in our regulations, those times and temperatures are specified.
Yes, already specified.
It needs to be in place. 11, hazard control and measures for preventing cross-contamination for category C and category I. For category I, we need to have specific requirements in place if packaging is used to provide a functional effect for food. Category I is obviously packaging. Certain technologies are coming around now A nice example is having some sort of UV light film
Yes.
on a plastic film.
Yeah.
If I'm selling you a plastic film with a UV filter in it, that UV filter must be on all parts of the film. If there's a section of that plastic film that does not have UV, as it should, then the product is going to be compromised, because that UV film is there for a purpose. And so what we're really intending here is that if a specific packaging requires to be a specific specification, all of it has to be in place. We have to make sure that all those requirements are met to make sure that the shelf life is not compromised.
Yes.
To make sure the safety is not compromised. There should be a specified requirement in place for an inspection process at lairage and at the evisceration to ensure animals are fit for human consumption. Now, C1, that again is slaughterhouse handling.
Yeah.
That has been in place by inspectors locally.
Yes,
in our regulations. It is in place. And in lairage is obviously when they're waiting before they get slaughtered. That's going to look not just at animal welfare issues. Meat quality is affected by the way they're handled, but also just inspecting them to see, are they sick or not?
Yeah.
You want to make sure that the sick animals are not entering the supply chain. And then at the evisceration process, that's when they eviscerate, they take the insides out. There obviously is an inspection to see for diseases inside the animal on the brown and the red viscera.
Yeah.
Number 12, PRP verification for category C, D, G, I, and K. Everyone has PRPs.
Yes.
We have to have PRPs. We've all done the ISO technical specification. 22002 dash whatever number you fall in under. You need to verify that your PRP is in place. What does verify mean? Verify means that you need to check that it's been implemented.
Yes.
And you need to check that it's been implemented properly.
Yeah.
If you've got a cleaning checklist, you verify that the person's filled it in correctly.
Yeah.
You fill in a form which denotes that the cleaning happened properly as well. The organization shall have routine site inspections, PRP checks, to verify that the site is maintained in a suitable condition to ensure food safety.
It just says routine there. It doesn't specify monthly, yearly, whatever it is.
No, it doesn't. Which means we have to look at the risk.
Yeah.
If there are certain PRPs that we need to look at daily, then we must do that. If it's a high risk issue, that's fine. We need to look at it. It depends on the health of your organization as well, on your food safety culture. It's a very important part of this. If you think of a glass checklist and you list, you might have windows in your production facility and you put it on your glass checklist. You can look at that once a month. And that's fine. That's fine if your staff, when the window breaks, report it to you.
Yeah.
If your staff's behavior are such that they don't report it to you, then we have a problem.
Yeah.
Then maybe once a month is not good enough. Maybe we need to look at it every day.
Yeah.
Because then I know at least it's only a day's production that's compromised.
Yeah.
It's also important to know what is documented, because that in the event of a recall can have disastrous effects. If we're only doing a glass checklist once a month and glass ends up in a product and we find out 20 days later, it's 20 days worth of product we have to consider being affected.
Yeah.
And you can't go on guesswork when you do a recall. You have to go on fact.
Yeah.
So yes, sometimes once a day seems a bit much. Maybe it should be less. It depends on your risk. It depends on your culture. And it depends on the risk you're willing to take in the event of a recall needing to be initiated. And just see second point there, the frequency and content of the verification based on risk. Exactly what I've just said. With defined sampling criteria and linked to the relevant technical specification. So in the technical spec, we might have specific requirements, and depending on the risk, we need to define how we're going to sample it. Are we going to look at all the windows? Well, on a glass checklist, you probably are. On a knife checklist, you're going to look at all the knives because one of them might be chipped.
Yes.
Certain other PRPs you might not. Checking that your bait stations are still secure. Do you do that every day? It's not necessary every day necessarily. Depends on your pest control issue. If you live on if you're on a farm in the middle of nowhere and you've got massive rat infestations, you better make sure that it's working properly all the time. So it's risk-based, and then once you know the risk, you define your sampling criteria. You say, this is how often I will be looking at.
Yes.
And I'll make sure that the PRP is in place. When they talk PRPs, it's all the PRPs in your system, which is dictated by the FSSC technical specifications. So all the PRPs dictated in the spec are required to be verified.
Sure.
Right, 13, product development. I was amused when I saw that this was in here. I actually started incorporating it into my food safety systems because I was irritated with this lack of communication between NPD and having a spec.
Often happens.
And it's sort of, I don't know, it was just frustrating. And then I saw this in here and I had a good laugh.
Now it's a requirement.
Now it's a requirement. So there should be a documented new product development protocol in place to ensure that safe and legal products are produced. So the whole thing right at the outset, you come up with this great idea.
Yeah.
We have to make sure that it's legally compliant.
Yeah.
A good idea is making sure that we use approved suppliers.
Yeah.
Approved ingredients. Make sure that ingredient is approved. Rather use an improved ingredient when you make it than creating some new funky thing, and then we have to go and catch up with all this approval process before we launch the product.
The problem can also come when, especially if a customer comes to you and they want something specific, and now all of a sudden you have to, cook up something that is very specific for them, then you might not have all these things in place already.
It's okay to do that, but I think it comes down to your food safety culture.
Yeah.
Understanding how the systems work with one another. It would be a good idea that your new product development division follows due course and actually, before they acquire the samples, sends your supplier questionnaires.
Yes.
Gets the certificates in place. Gets your CAAs and specs.
Yeah.
It can be part of the process of NPD.
Yeah.
But make sure that they're right.
Yeah.
If you're getting a new spice from somewhere, make sure you've defined what the micro requirements are to make sure that you legally comply.
Yeah.
And make sure that your development is also within the legal framework. In South Africa, we've got a law that says you can only use the preservatives listed in the regulation.
Yeah.
So if some person comes with a new preservation technology, and I'm talking more about ingredients used as preservatives, you're not really legally allowed to use it.
Yeah.
So engage with the Department of Health, see if you can get a concession, see if you can use this new technology, and make sure that you err on the side of caution and stay on the legal side.
Yeah.
This is not just a new product development, but you might have changes to products or processes.
Yes.
You might have a new piece of equipment which has risks associated to it. You might have to reformulate a product because maybe your tomato sauce supplier burnt down and now you need a completely new tomato sauce in there. Then we need to make sure that when we do those changes and we revise recipes, that it's safe and legal. The procedure we put together must include the evaluation of the impact of the change that it will have on the system. So we're documenting this whole process now.
Yeah.
What is the impact that this change that we're going to do have on the system?
Yeah.
So if we are a meat processing facility and now all of a sudden we want to pack cheese, what risks is bringing cheese going to have on our process, on our entire system?
Yeah.
Are we going to be, if we're bringing soft cheeses into a cooked meat high-risk facility to be packed, we're bringing listeria into a high-risk facility. We can't do that.
Yeah.
So we have to understand those risks and understand the impact it might have on the system. We have to consider what impact the changes will have on the process flow for the new and existing products and processes. So if you've got a current flow diagram that you would have based your HACCP on, is it going to change?
Yeah.
Is it going to bring new risks in?
Yeah.
Is it going to eliminate risks? Are we going to have to edit the rest of the system around that? What resources and training needs are required? It was documented what resources and training needs we need. Is there maybe a new procedure that we need to train our staff on to operate something or to make some sort of functional change there? And Remember that with the FSSC, everything must be documented. You can't just
Yeah.
someone make something new and
Yeah.
tell the person to
Yeah.
do something.
Yeah.
You need to have documented training in place.
Yes.
Equipment and maintenance requirements. Obviously, you might need a new piece of equipment, so you get
Yeah.
that, and then you need to schedule your maintenance and put it on the
Yes.
planned maintenance schedule. And then lastly, the need to conduct production trials to validate the product formulation processes are capable of producing a safe product that meet customer requirements. Obviously, once it's ready to go in the factory and we've considered the risks to our current products and we've made sure it's safe and everything's fine, we then have to conduct trials to check and then make sure that it works.
Yeah.
Both the formulation, so maybe we're making a sausage, we want to see that it binds properly, and then the processes that we're using are capable to make sure that the product is safe. So obviously this thing goes into that sort of product testing stage. We make the product, we validate that everything works properly, and we send it away for analysis to make sure that it's not sitting with high levels of pathogens, and that we get our shelf life and that we meet our customer needs and requirements.
I think this one is also, this requirement helps you to think about these things beforehand and not afterwards, like after the product has already been manufactured. Now you want to go and change and think about the risks and things like that.
Definitely. Definitely. I think this is certainly something that needs to be, attention to detail needs to be given to the product development process before you manufacture it and put it onto the shelf. And so talking with the retailer who demands certain things is a very important part of this, because you can't rush to get a product out.
No.
You must follow the steps before the product is launched. 14, health status for category D. There must be a procedure in place to ensure that the health of personnel does not have an adverse effect on feed production operations. Category D is obviously animal food. So we need to look at the health status of the manufacturers. There should be medical screening prior to working in contact with feed. Additional medicals may be conducted as required by the organization. There's a very big emphasis on doing medicals of staff to approve them and make sure that they are not going to be able to contaminate feed given to animals. This should be in place for your food handlers as well already. And note on, there's a whole lot of information, but medicals and medical screening needs to be conducted by a medical professional, a registered medical professional. It is best practice to go to a nurse or a doctor, a registered nurse or a doctor. You can go to some of the allied health guys, but I would strongly advise you to stick to going to registered medical professionals. Our last additional requirement is for categories A, E, F1 and G. And this is a requirement for organizations for multi-site certifications. Management shall ensure that sufficient resources are available and roles are defined for all involved in the system. So when we've got multiple sites, we often have a head office and we have multiple different sites doing different things. Management must make sure that these resources and roles are for everyone in the system. So at all the sites.
Implemented across all the sites.
The internal audit requirements must be in place for every single site. Internal auditors must be independent from the areas they audit. So essentially what we want to say there is an internal auditor must not check their own work. So it can be someone, internal auditor can be someone from the same company, but they must be impartial. The food safety management system, centralized function in all sites, must be audited at least annually or more frequently based on risk. You have to, at minimum, check that the entire system is in place every year.
As a minimum.
As a minimum. But if it's more risky, like we might have listeria issues and cleaning issues in a high-risk facility, it probably based on risk needs to be checked more often than once a year. The internal audit reports shall be subject to a technical review, including addressing the non-conformances. One has to make sure that this actual audit process is done properly, thoroughly, and technically someone within the division needs to check that it is and thoroughly done. And then the big thing is that, okay, we've done an internal audit, you've got non-conformances. Have you addressed it? Have you finished it out? Have we upgraded from it? Have we
Yes.
learned from it? Are we continually improving from it?
Yeah.
And lastly, internal auditors and technical reviewers shall be subject to annual performance monitoring and calibration. So every year we must demonstrate that our internal auditors and our reviewers are continually being monitored for their work,
Yeah.
and being calibrated and made sure that they're sticking at the standard we expect of them.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that this is only for multi-site organizations, and I'm surprised that that level of detail has not been incorporated in the rest of the sections.
Yeah.
So if you're a food producer, I would strongly suggest you implement this level of internal auditing as well.
Yeah.
But I think this is a very, very thorough way of doing internal audits, and it's all about the integrity of a multi-site facility certification.
They even go into the details of the requirements for internal auditors, like for instance, their work experience, education, training.
That's the bare minimum requirements. So from a work experience perspective, 2 years full-time work experience in the food industry, including at least 1 year in the organization. That means if I've been working for 10 years in the food industry and I get hired at your organization and I haven't worked for you for 1 year yet, I can't be an internal auditor.
Yes.
In terms of education, you need to complete a higher education course, or in the absence of a formal course, have at least 5 years work experience in the food production or manufacturing, transport and storage, retailing, inspection, or enforcement areas. So you need to be well educated to be an internal auditor.
Yeah.
And then specific training for the FSSC 22000 auditors. The lead auditor must have completed a food safety management system, quality management system, or FSSC 22000 lead auditor course of at least 40 hours. So that's the normal lead auditor course that people can conduct in industry. Other auditors in the internal audit team must have successfully completed an internal auditor course of 16 hours covering audit principles, practices, and techniques. CRSSA is putting together some of those courses that can be done. And the training may be provided by the qualified lead auditor. So you can do internal training with your company by the lead auditor, but the lead auditor must have gone through a proper lead auditor's course, or through an external training provider like ourselves. It should cover at least ISO 22000. So the relevant prerequisite programs based on the technical spec for the sector. So if you are working in animal feed, you must be trained on the animal feed technical specification. And then the FSSC additional requirements, and the minimum course, the course hours is a minimum of 8 hours. 8 hours is not enough to go through all those standards. I would recommend that you spend at least 2 days on ISO 22000 and FSSC, and probably another day or two on the technical specification, just to get to grips with that.
Because 8 hours is pretty much 1 day.
8 hours is 1 day, which you won't get to grips with the ISO 22000 standard in 1 day.
Not at all.
Unless you're seriously experienced and have knowledge of those things prior to it.
Sure, that's bringing us to the end. Thanks so much for that, Matthew.
That's a pleasure. Yeah, thank you for bearing with us and going through those additional requirements. That was an overview of the additional requirements. We do have a number of courses looking at the details of some of those elements. So things like environmental monitoring, food fraud, food defense, allergen management, even our SQA and specifications set up in our system for approved supplier list. We've got an SQA training module which would help with the management of services. So these are all courses that you guys are welcome to contact us and engage with us and see if we can assist you. But the main thing is this is an overview course. We've made you aware of what those additional requirements are. We've given you some good examples of those additional requirements. It should be pretty self-explanatory. You're going to have to sit with your food safety teams and discuss those requirements, make sure that they're applicable to you, and then you're going to have to think about ways around implementing systems to make sure you're compliant there. And again, we as a consulting body are able to assist you. So if you want us to be a part of your discussion with your food safety team, maybe guiding you in the right way, or putting some ideas on the table, or even just reviewing what you think you want to do for that section.
I think it always helps if you just have a extra pair of eyes just looking at your plan and making sure you are on track and not wasting time on things that are maybe not as important and skipping things that you should actually be paying attention to.
You know, and often people, when they get involved, it can get quite complex quite quickly. And so it's nice to have an external pair of eyes just to try and simplify it as well. I mean, although there's a lot of words here and we are looking at an internationally recognized auditable standard, I think it is good to keep it simple. Because simple means that you can achieve it.
Definitely.
That brings us to the end of today's discussion. Go to our website at sirius.co.za and take the quiz. A small little test just to test your knowledge on today's discussion. You will also find an attendance register, which you can download for your own records, and make contact with us and let us know, give us some feedback, and also let us know if there's anything that we can assist with.